Gunfights, outlaws, lawmen, this is the frontier. Hit subscribe and join the story. The Cumberland River cut its way through Tennessee like a dark scar, winding past rocky ridges and forested hills. On a late autumn evening, the valley lay draped in a thin mist, the air heavy with the smell of gunpowder and smoke from distant Union encampments. Somewhere in those ridges, cloaked by shadows and silence, an old farmer turned sniper prepared for another night of war. His name was Jack Hinson, but among soldiers he had become something else entirely, the Phantom of the Ridges. By now, the Union Army knew his work well. Officers lay dead, shot clean from their saddles. Patrols had been picked off one by one, never seeing the marksman who stalked them. Some swore it was more than a man. Perhaps a ghost, perhaps the spirit of the South itself, embodied in an aging figure who carried a rifle longer than any they had ever seen. But Jack was flesh and blood, and his motives were as human as they were deadly. That evening the ridges were quiet except for the faint clatter of boots and the distant whinny of horses. Jack lay belly down on a bed of leaves, his custom-made .50 caliber rifle steady against a stone. Through its long barrel he could see a cluster of blue coats gathering by a campfire near the river bend. They were laughing, drinking, unaware of the death that watched them from across the valley. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. He had no interest in ordinary soldiers, young boys who had been conscripted into a war they barely understood. But tonight was different. Among the men stood a Union major, a man Jack recognized from whispers in town, an officer who had ordered the burning of farms, the taking of livestock, the punishment of civilians suspected of aiding Confederate sympathizers. Jack's jaw tightened. This was no innocent. The wind shifted, carrying with it the sharp tang of pine. Jack steadied his breathing, waiting for the right moment. The major leaned forward to light his pipe. That was all it took. The rifle cracked like thunder, echoing across the valley. In an instant, the major toppled backward, his pipe clattering into the fire. Chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled, muskets raised, searching the darkened ridges. But there was no trace, no silhouette, no telltale sign of where the shot had come from. By the time they fired blindly into the tree line, Jack was already gone, slipping into the woods like a shadow swallowed by night. News of the killing spread quickly. By morning, Union camps buzzed with fear. "The ghost is out there," one soldier muttered, refusing to sit with his back to the woods. "He sees us before we see him." Officers tried to rally morale, insisting that the sniper was just one old man, a fugitive soon to be caught. But deep down, the men weren't so sure. How could one man vanish so completely? How could he strike with such precision, always leaving death in his wake and never a trace of his passage? Meanwhile, in the small cabins and farmhouses scattered across Tennessee, another kind of whisper spread. To the townsfolk who had lost sons and brothers to Union patrols, Jack Hinson was no ghost. He was flesh, blood, and vengeance. Some called him a hero, others a doomed soul. But all agreed that his story was becoming legend. Mothers would hush their children with tales of the old farmer who had turned the woods into his battlefield. Songs began to weave themselves in taverns, verses that painted Jack as a hunter of the oppressors, a man who refused to surrender. Jack, for his part, carried the weight of every shot. He was not reckless, he did not kill for the thrill of it. Each bullet carried memory. The faces of his executed sons, the cries of his grieving wife, the bitter oath he had sworn by their graves. Yet beneath that oath, there was a growing hollowness. With each officer he brought down, the question lingered. How many deaths would it take to quiet his rage? That night, after the major's body was buried, the Union patrols intensified. Cavalry rode hard through the hills, searching every hollow and ravine. Bonfires were lit to flush him out. Jack watched from a ridge as they scoured the land, torches swaying like angry fireflies. He could hear their curses, their threats, their promises of what they'd do if they ever caught him. But the ridge was his home. He knew every tree, every deer path, every trick of the terrain. To the Union soldiers it was hostile wilderness. To Jack it was a fortress. He melted into it, unseen, untouchable, as if the land itself conspired to protect him. And so the war within a war deepened. By day, Jack was an aging farmer with a weathered face and eyes shadowed by grief. By night, he was the silent rifleman, feared and hunted, yet never caught. To the men in blue, he was a phantom. To the people of Tennessee, he was the proof that even one broken man could strike back against an empire. As the Cumberland flowed black under the moonlight, Jack sat on a fallen log, rifle across his knees. He thought of his sons, of the life that had been stolen from him, of the oath that had driven him into these shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Jack lifted his gaze to the stars, cold and distant, and whispered to the night, "I will not stop. Not until they remember what they took from me." And with that, the phantom faded once more into the darkness, the war still burning silently in his heart. The morning after Major Overton's death, the Cumberland Valley was alive with shouts and the pounding of hooves. Union patrols swept through the countryside in tight formation, their rifles slung across their shoulders, their eyes darting to every ridge and thicket. Smoke from hastily built signal fires curled into the sky, a warning to every detachment within miles. The phantom had struck again. For the men in blue, fear was becoming as heavy as the gear they carried. They had faced open battles before, lines of muskets firing, cannons roaring. But this was different. Here in Tennessee, an unseen enemy haunted the ridges, one they couldn't fight with drills or formations. A single shot could split the silence and leave an officer dead in an instant. Worst of all, no one knew where the bullet had come from. Colonel William Henshaw, a stern officer with a reputation for ruthlessness, arrived to take command of the search. He rode a black horse, his blue coat dusted from the hard march, his jaw clenched in fury. Standing before a cluster of weary soldiers, he spoke in a voice that carried across the camp. "This outlaw farmer believes he can bleed us from the shadows. He is mistaken. For every officer he kills, 10 civilians will pay the price. If the people of this valley think they can hide him, they'll learn the cost of defiance." The soldiers shifted uneasily, but none dared speak. Orders were orders. Soon, barns were burned, fields trampled, livestock seized. Families were dragged from their homes and interrogated. Women pleaded, children cried, old men protested. But the blue-coated soldiers moved like an occupying storm, leaving only ashes behind. From a high ridge, Jack Hinson watched it all. He crouched low in the brush, his long rifle resting across his knees. His weathered face was tight with anger, but his eyes were steady. This was the price of his war, the shadow that fell over innocent lives because of the oath he had sworn. Yet, when he thought of his sons, of their broken bodies left in the dust by Union soldiers, his rage burned hotter than his guilt. "They brought this upon themselves," he muttered, his voice little more than a growl carried away by the wind. "And I will answer them." That evening, Union scouts pushed further into the woods, determined to corner the sniper. They moved cautiously, rifles raised, boots crunching over dry leaves. Every tree felt like a threat, every shadow a hiding place for the phantom. Private Samuel Green, barely 18, lagged at the rear of the patrol. He tried to steady his nerves, but his hands trembled as he clutched his musket. "It ain't natural," he whispered to the soldier beside him. "A man that old shouldn't move like smoke. My granddaddy's his age. He can't even walk straight." The soldier gave a nervous laugh, but his eyes never left the tree line. "Maybe it ain't a man at all." Before Green could reply, a sharp crack split the forest. The lieutenant leading the patrol collapsed, a hole clean through his chest. Panic seized the men. Muskets fired blindly into the woods, smoke clouding the air. But the phantom was gone before they could take aim, leaving only silence and the fallen officer as proof of his presence. When the survivors stumbled back to camp, Colonel Henshaw's fury boiled over. He ordered double patrols, stricter punishments, harsher treatment of locals. In his mind, the farmer-turned-sniper could not survive without help. Someone was feeding him, hiding him, guiding him through the woods. And if he couldn't catch the phantom, he would crush the community around him until someone broke. The raids grew more violent. Families suspected of sympathy were driven from their homes. At night, the glow of burning cabins lit the sky, while the cries of the displaced echoed through the valley. Yet still, Jack remained free. Still, he struck when least expected. Among the soldiers, morale rotted. Letters sent north spoke of the sniper who stalked them like a wolf. Some men refused to patrol alone. Others muttered that they'd rather face 1,000 Confederates in the open than one old farmer in the woods. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, Jack sat alone by a cold fire, his rifle across his lap. The faces of the innocent weighed on him, the children weeping in the ruins of their homes, the mothers clutching what little they had left. He had never sought to bring them suffering. His war was against the officers, the men who gave the orders, the men whose cruelty had stolen his sons. But vengeance was never clean. It stained everything it touched. As he cleaned his rifle, Jack whispered to himself, "This is the path I chose. I can't turn back now." He lifted his gaze to the darkening woods, the place that had become both his refuge and his battlefield. He knew the Union's fury would not fade. If anything, it would grow sharper, more desperate. The question was not whether they would come, it was how many more lives would burn in the fire between him and them. For the first time since he had taken up the rifle, Jack wondered if the ghost he had become was haunting not just the soldiers, but everyone in the Cumberland Valley. The river rolled black beneath the stars, carrying the weight of secrets, sorrows, and oaths unbroken. The war within a war was no longer just his. It had swallowed the land itself. And in the silence, the phantom of the ridges prepared for another night. The Cumberland Valley no longer breathed in peace. Once green fields now lay scorched, fences toppled, smoke rising from blackened chimneys where homes had stood. The war between North and South had spilled into every hollow, but here it was sharper, crueler, because of one man's oath. Colonel Henshaw tightened his grip on the region like a noose. His soldiers, frustrated and afraid, unleashed their wrath on the valley's people. They kicked down doors in the dead of night, searching for food stores, weapons, or even the faintest trace of the phantom sniper. Families who had once tried to remain neutral now found themselves branded as traitors. Cattle vanished, wagons were seized, and the valley's lifeblood was drained one act of vengeance at a time. To the Union officers, this was necessary cruelty. To Jack Hinson, it was fuel for the fire. From his hidden camp among the rocks, Jack watched the chaos unfold. His heart clenched at the suffering of neighbors who had once shared bread with his family. He knew some cursed his name now, whispering that their misery was the shadow of his revenge. Yet when he remembered the butchered bodies of his sons, innocent boys dragged from their father's land, his jaw hardened. "They will learn," he muttered, running his hand over the polished stock of his rifle. "Every command, every raid, will cost them blood." That night he set out again. The moon hung pale above the ridges as he crawled into position overlooking a Union picket line. The soldiers below huddled near their campfires, weary from days of hunting a ghost. Jack steadied his rifle, breath slowing, the world narrowing into the iron sights. One squeeze of the trigger, and another officer slumped to the dirt. Before the alarm could spread, Jack vanished into the darkness, leaving only whispers and fear behind. By dawn, rumors swept the valley. Some claimed the phantom had wings and moved faster than a man could run. Others swore he never slept, his rifle always watching from the hills. Whatever the truth, soldiers grew restless. Deserters slipped away in the night, unwilling to march beneath a sky that might spit death at any moment. Colonel Henshaw's fury boiled over. He ordered mass punishments, rounding up suspected sympathizers and driving them into makeshift camps. Barns were torched as warnings, fields salted to cripple the harvest. To him, every blaze was a signal to Jack: surrender or watch your people starve. But Jack answered with blood. One morning, as a column of Union troops crossed a narrow road through the valley, his rifle cracked from the trees. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed, soldiers scattered, and in the confusion, Jack struck again and again. Each shot deliberate, each victim a man in command. By the time the troops rallied, the phantom was gone, leaving bodies strewn in the mud and terror in their ranks. The valley itself seemed to take sides. Children carried word of patrol movements, slipping notes beneath fence posts or scratching marks into trees. Old farmers left food near hollow logs where Jack would later find them. Though many feared the wrath of the Union, a quiet current of loyalty kept him alive. They saw in him not only vengeance but a kind of shield, however bloody, against the tide of occupation. Still, the cost grew unbearable. Widows wailed at the ashes of their homes. Hungry families fled south, seeking shelter beyond the ridges. For every officer Jack killed, 10 innocent voices cried out in the night. And though his heart was iron, Jack was not deaf. Their suffering clung to him like smoke, seeping into the seams of his resolve. One evening, as rain pattered against the leaves, Jack sat beneath his canvas tarp, staring into the fireless dark. He fingered the worn locket of his late wife, her face smiling back at him from another life. "What have I become?" he whispered. "A father avenging sons, or a ghost that curses the land he swore to protect?" Yet when the thunder rolled and he thought of the Union flag snapping in the valley wind, his grief hardened once more into rage. He slung his rifle across his back and disappeared into the rain, a hunter in the storm. By now, the Cumberland was no longer a place of farms and villages. It was a battlefield claimed by shadow and blood. The Union's fury had turned the valley into a graveyard, and Jack's vengeance painted its stones with the names of the fallen. No one, north or south, could say how it would end, only that as long as the ridges stood, the phantom would haunt them. And so, the valley bled on. Children were hushed with warnings. "Don't stray too far, or the phantom will find you," mothers whispered, though some spoke with pride, others with dread. To Union troops the whispers carried darker weight. Men shuffled nervously at dusk, eyes scanning the ridges as if the trees themselves hid his gaze. Jack Hinson had become more than a man. He was a legend, sharpened by rumor and fed by blood. Colonel Henshaw, once brash and certain, now sat hunched at his desk with maps strewn before him. The colonel's temper snapped like brittle wood. "Every time we move, he strikes," he barked to his captains. "One man, one cursed farmer holds an army hostage." Yet, in the quiet corners of camp, soldiers whispered what their commanders would not, that Hinson was no longer flesh and bone. Some said he was a spirit raised by his son's blood. Others swore he could turn invisible, his rifle an extension of the shadows. Whatever the truth, morale eroded like riverbanks in flood. Meanwhile, Jack moved through the wilderness like he had always belonged there. His hunting skills, honed long before war, made him nearly untouchable. He set snares not just for animals, but for men, laying false trails, carving signs into bark to mislead trackers. He knew the creeks and ridges as a sailor knows the stars. Still, he was not alone in this ghost war. Sympathizers in the valley fed the legend. Every story added fuel to the myth, until even those who had never seen his face could describe the phantom with chilling detail. Tall, gaunt, eyes hard as river stone, carrying a rifle that never missed. The whispers traveled farther than the valley. In Union camps along the Tennessee River, recruits heard tales of Hinson before they ever set foot in battle. Families accused of aiding him were dragged into the mud, their barns burned, their sons arrested. Some cursed Jack in secret for the ruin his war brought them. Others prayed for his vengeance to shield them, even as the cost grew unbearable. One night, a widow approached his hidden camp. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow. She dropped to her knees before him, hands clutching at his sleeve. A paper pinned to the corpse bore just 4 words: "For my sons." The soldiers trembled. Some begged their commanders for transfer, swearing they'd rather face open battle than the Phantom of the Valleys. Others deserted outright, vanishing into the woods before dawn. And so the whispers grew louder. Jack Hinson was no longer merely avenging father or grieving farmer. He was a symbol of what the war had unleashed: rage without mercy, a ghost that no bullet could kill. From the shadows of his camp, Jack listened to the wind carry his name. The legend comforted him, but it also haunted him. For every enemy he struck down, another innocent bore the cost. For every whisper of his strength, there was a cry of suffering he could not silence. Yet when dawn broke and the river mist curled over the valley, Jack lifted his rifle once more. The oath still burned, and the whispers, whether curse or hymn, drove him forward into the war without end. By the winter of 1863, the valley no longer belonged to its people. It belonged to shadows, silent, waiting, deadly. The Union Army still marched its columns through the Cumberland, but each man rode with eyes wide and rifles gripped tight, as if the trees themselves carried a pulse. For Jack Hinson, the land had become both ally and prison. The river's winding bends offered cover for his shots, the ridges served as walls for his sanctuary, and the forests fed him. Yet every familiar place now carried the stain of blood. Where once he had taught his sons to fish, he now lay in wait for officers. Where once his fields had thrived, only weeds and memory remained. The legend of the Phantom grew darker with each strike. Newspapers carried fragments of the story, stripped of humanity and painted in bold strokes. "Sniper terrorizes Union forces," one headline read, branding Jack a faceless monster. Yet in hushed circles among Southerners, he was whispered as the Avenger, a man who stood when others could not. But Jack knew the truth. He was no hero. One evening, snowflakes drifted across the valley, softening the ruined fences and charred barns. Jack crouched on a ridge, the barrel of his rifle steady against the cold rock. Below, a Union patrol marched single file, their voices carried thin in the frozen air. He could see their faces, boys no older than his sons had been. For a long moment he did not pull the trigger. His hands shook, not from cold, but from weariness. Vengeance had fueled him, but what remained now was only emptiness. Every life he took filled the silence, but none brought his sons back. None soothed the cries of widows, the tears of mothers, the broken prayers of the valley. At last he lowered the rifle. The soldiers passed unharmed, their footsteps fading into the snow. Jack sat back against the rock, breath heavy, haunted by the question that gnawed at him in the long nights. Had he become the very thing he hated? The Union, however, could not let the whispers rest. Colonel Henshaw intensified his hunt, sending fresh detachments into the hills. Camps were burned, livestock seized, families punished. Each action meant to smoke out the phantom only deepened the legend. Yet even the soldiers themselves began to wonder if their enemy was truly a man. One officer recorded in his diary, "This Hinson fights like a ghost. If he breathes, I have never heard it. If he sleeps, the earth hides him. We fear him more than we fear the rebel army." Fear became a sickness. Men deserted, supply lines faltered, and discipline broke under the weight of dread. Jack, unseen and unreachable, held the valley in his grip, not through numbers, but through terror. Still, the shadows cut both ways. Jack could not reveal himself to neighbors, could not visit the graves of his sons in daylight. His surviving family lived under constant suspicion. He was bound to his oath, but it chained him to isolation, gnawing at his spirit until the man he had once been seemed like a ghost himself. One night, sitting by his fire, Jack unfolded the Bible his wife had given him long ago. Its pages were worn, the words faded by smoke and ash. His hand lingered over a verse about vengeance and justice. He wondered whether God had turned his face from the valley, or whether Jack had simply stepped so far into the shadows that no light could reach him. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of distant bugles. Another patrol moved through his land, another chance for vengeance, another step into the endless war. Jack closed the Bible. He lifted his rifle. Thus ended the year in the Valley of Shadows. The farmer turned phantom, the father turned legend. He was feared, hated, admired, cursed, but above all, he was never forgotten. His war was no longer fought with battles alone, but with whispers, etched into every heart that lived under the shadow of his rifle. And as the Union tightened its grip and the Confederacy faltered, one truth remained certain. Jack Hinson would not surrender. This is the close of Episode 4 of The Silent War of Jack Hinson. If you want to uncover how Jack E.S. Ghost War pushed deeper into the blood-soaked years ahead, and whether vengeance could ever find peace, join us for Episode 5. Don't miss the next chapter of this gripping, true-to-life saga. Subscribe, follow, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the legend unfolding.